There has never been a better time to find the types of employers who are going to support you in your career and in your life. And I almost feel like, don't worry about what, the big name brand folks are doing. Like, don't even get concerned about that, because you can find great companies that are actually leveraging what's happening right now as an opportunity to think different about how they want to organize their workforce, managers who want to think different and manage differently. And it may take some sleuthing and some networking to find those opportunities, but you can, and there's never been a better time to do so.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 229 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I'm speaking with Tammy Foreman, Executive Director of Path Forward. Path Forward is a nonprofit organization on a mission to empower people to restart their careers after time spent focused on caregiving. We fulfill this mission by working with companies to create mid-career internships, also known as returnships, that give professionals a jumpstart back to their careers, while giving companies access to a diverse, untapped talent force. I had Tammy on the podcast way back in 2019 in episode number 128. I wanted to bring Tammy back to discuss how the pandemic has affected their mission, given they primarily focus on caregivers who are mostly women, and this recession has been called the She Session. I thought it would be appropriate to get her perspective on the recovery from the pandemic. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community continues to help the members who are participating in this project grow and thrive. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Let's hear what Vicky had to say about being part of the community.
For me, I would say it's the resources that you've made available to the community, whether it's bringing on speakers who have insights into the current hiring and job searching trends, especially during the pandemic. This has been so useful. Highlighting companies that are providing remote work for older adults. And again, this is how I was able to get my current part-time job, but also helping me to see new possibilities about what work might look like now and in the immediate future, because, this is so important. The traditional jobs that our generation was raised with have essentially evaporated. And so that's really what's been most helpful to me most recently.
I'm recruiting new members for the next cohort. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, on to my discussion with Tammy Foreman. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Tammy Foreman on the podcast again, who I had on 2 years ago, who is the executive director of Path Forward. Welcome to the podcast, Tammy.
Thanks for having me back, Mark. It's great to be here.
Well, why don't we start out by you just telling us what the heck is Path Forward?
Yes. So Path Forward is a nonprofit organization. We're on a mission to empower caregivers who've taken time away from their professional career to be a stay-at-home mom, to care for an elder parent, any of those caregiving responsibilities. And our job is to empower them to restart their professional careers by working with employers to create return to work programs, primarily returnships, which we can talk more about. We started this organization 5 years ago. And lately, I have a lot of people asking me if I could see into the future and imagine a time when women's workforce participation rates would fall as low as they have fallen. And no, I did not see into the future. I saw the present 5 years ago, which is this has been a problem for a long time.
Why don't you tell us what exactly you define as a returnship?
Yeah, so we think of returnships as programs that are specifically aimed at people who are restarting their careers from caregiving. And by restarting, we mean, someone who had a professional career, who spent a certain amount of time, usually about 5 to 10 years, after college working professionally in their chosen field, but then stepped away from the workforce in order to, as I said, care for children, elder parents, maybe a relative got sick. And a returnship is a program that is aimed particularly at that population. So not someone who's starting a new career like an internship might help someone do, or relearning, or getting trained in a career like an apprenticeship, but really about someone returning to their professional career. They're usually temporary. They're usually 3 to 6 months in length. They're always paid. There are a few companies that are doing direct hire into their return to work programs, meaning they just hire someone as a full-time employee. We see a few employers doing that, not many yet. So there's different structures to them, but that's the basic outline of most of the programs that we see and that we work with employers on creating.
We're coming out of this thing called a pandemic.
Yes, we are.
And so how did things go during the pandemic?
Yeah. So during the pandemic, it was definitely tough. Being an organization running hiring programs when no one's hiring is hard. And everyone just kind of stopped, right? If you think back to March, April, May, June of 2020, like employers just stopped whatever they were doing. And it was nobody knew, right? Nobody knew how long this was going to last or what was going to happen and how it was going to go. And I would say by the fall of 2020, we were starting to see signs that employers were like, okay, we can't just not hire. So obviously there were industries that were being specifically impacted by the pandemic. You think of things like travel and hospitality, but other companies were starting to think forward and say, all right, well, we need to start hiring again. We need to actually backfill some of the people maybe that we lost in 2020. So we started to see signs towards the end of 2020 that things were going to really pick up. And 2021 has been a lot busier as companies are reopening opportunities and starting to hire again. But it was hard. And then, just from the sidelines watching women's careers just get decimated, like the extent to which I remember one moment I remember in particular, I think it was Massachusetts had put out this plan, and it like completely glossed over the fact that schools shutting down meant that families had nowhere to send their children all day. And that was just this sort of gaping hole that no one was even addressing what that meant for families in terms of their economic life, but women in terms of their careers. And we're still seeing that play out right up until now.
Yeah, one of the things I wrote a blog post on the disconnect in the job market right now. And one of the big disconnects is the fact that half the childcare facilities went out of business during the pandemic. Schools are still mostly closed until September. So there really is no childcare. So you shut out basically largely women who have children out of the job market.
Yeah. There was a study that came out recently that showed that actually women with school-age children were more likely to be out of the workforce than women with younger children, right? Children under age 5. And it was, it was one of those things where it's like the economists were like, why could that be? And it's like, well, if you ask any working mom, you know why, because finding a sitter or a local care facility for a younger child, even as decimated as that industry is still easier than if your kid needs to do Zoom kindergarten. Like that's not something you can, you have to do that, right? You have to do that and you have to help them with that.
So what do you see picking up now? What segments are starting these returnships back?
We are continuing to see, we work with a lot of tech employers, and that's still an area of the economy that we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of traction. And obviously technology is one of the industries that has not been hurt by the pandemic, right? In the same way, because those jobs have, first of all, they're amenable to working from home into a remote environment. Many of those companies are continuing to see people are buying things online, they're doing things online, and particularly as the rest of the consumer economy starts to pick up, we're seeing even more of that. So we're continuing to see hiring in the tech sector, and I imagine that will continue. I think as other parts of the economy start to open up through the end of this year, and I think we're going to see a real just in general, a burst of economic activity in September, October, and through the end of the year. I think there's just going to be, as Broadway opens here in New York, as more and more live events start to come online, I think we're going to start to see, as the schools reopen, in many areas fully reopen, it's going to be, I think we're going to start to see that economic activity pick up a lot.
You mean I'll be able to go into a theater?
I think you will. I think you'll be able to go into an actual theater. I know. I think it's true. It's true.
I just did it on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I talked about the 26 coffee meetings I had when I was in Austin. And I had 7 people who were, everyone was over 50, had been vaccinated for 2 and 3 and 4 months. And I was the first person they were meeting outside of their house.
Yeah.
And I'm going, wow.
Yeah, it's going to take a while, I think, for some people to feel really comfortable. And but I think that pent up energy is really going to start to open up through the summer and the fall, especially. I think it's going to be quite busy and quite interesting.
So do you see the returnships, including those people who've been out of the market for the last 1.5 to 2 years due to COVID?
Yeah. So right now, it's interesting. I joked at the top of this. I keep getting, I've been asked by a few people, like, how did you know there was a pandemic coming? How did you see this coming 5 years ago when you started this organization? It's like, no. This was a problem 5 years ago. And, the schools is such an interesting piece of it, right, Mark? Because like before the pandemic, school was closed at 3:00 in the afternoon, right? Before the pandemic, there was no school in the summer. Right before the pandemic, there was very little, and to this day, there is very little to no public financing of childcare below the age of 5 in most areas. And to your point, the privately funded options are not always plentiful, and even less so now. So this has been a problem for a long time. So right now, we're still seeing a lot of people who've been out of work for a while and have been looking for a while and have been trying to get back into the workforce for a long time. And, I think the people who have been out, I think it'll be interesting to see this fall as the schools open up, as families start to feel like things are going back to normal, some semblance of normal, to see if we get a burst of folks. I suspect that some of the people who have been out of the workforce just because of the pandemic will find ways outside of returnships back into their careers. And I think that's true for a couple of reasons. I mean, some of them, if they've been on a leave, even an extended leave, may go back to their employer, right? They may still have those connections. They are still connected into their network to some extent, right? So prior to the pandemic, a pattern we saw pretty clearly was it gets really difficult for people to get back into full-time work if they've been out of the workforce for 2 years or more. There's a real break point at that 2-year mark. And then when you start to talk about people who've been out of the workforce for 5 years or more, it gets really difficult. So I think when we look this September and frankly through the end of the year at people who have been out of the workforce for a year and a half, I think they're going to be able to find ways back in. We'll obviously be there to help them if they think a returnship is the right spot for them to restart, for sure. But I'm more worried about, there's two groups I'm more worried about. I'm more worried about the people who were out of work for several years before the pandemic even started, who are still struggling to get back. And I'm worried about the people who left for the pandemic, who are not going to come right back, but are going to find that their time out of the workforce gets extended and are looking to come back in a year, 2 years, 5 years. I've talked to enough women to know those years can go by quick, and they may find themselves thinking like, I was only going to be out for the pandemic, and it's been a couple of years now.
Yeah, I have one former employee who quit her job in January of 2020, thinking she would take a break and then get back to work. And obviously that didn't happen. Unfortunately, she started a business around being a voiceover artist. But the other one was, I have a former neighbor who had gone through hell the last couple of years with a sister dying, mother dying, taking care of the estate. And she stopped working in January of 2020. And her health is in decline. And she's now 18 months later, going, maybe it's time for me to go back to work, although she really is not in the right mindset to go back to work. Has the clientele that you deal with, has it grown? Are the number of partners you're dealing with grown? What?
Yes. So we've definitely seen growth on the employer side. And I would say the silver lining from my perspective to the pandemic is it has raised the awareness for everyone, but particularly for employers, that, I think prior to the pandemic, I would have more people ask me some version of like, well, do they really want to come back to work? There was this sort of skepticism that if someone had left the workforce, particularly for childcare, right? A mom who had left to take care of her children really wanted to be at home, right? Like that was her really what she wanted. And there was this sort of skepticism about whether or not she'd stay and kind of that sort of thing we would get. And I don't hear as much of that anymore. I think the realization that like, oh, sometimes it's really not about a choice, right? If the school closes, the school closes. I don't have a choice. And those choices that women were making, primarily women were making even prior to the pandemic, were very constrained, right? Constrained by lack of childcare, constrained by, inflexible workplace policies. So I think there's a more awareness. We're definitely seeing growth on the employer side. We're seeing growth on the audience side. And again, I see that as like, this is just the fundamentals of why this was a problem before the pandemic haven't yet changed. We're starting to see some public policy. There was a lot of money in the first act that Biden signed for like summer school, for example. New York City, for the first time ever, is going to have essentially free summer camp for any kid that wants it. That's not something that we've ever had before. So there's a few things that are happening, but how long those will last as durable public policies remains to be seen. So I think this is going to be ongoing in terms of women's struggle to continue their careers and be the caregivers they want to be.
Have some of these employers taken their programs virtual?
All have.
Okay.
All have. And I would say the other silver lining to all of this is the realization by many employers that like, oh, all those jobs that we convinced ourselves could never, ever, ever, ever be done from home actually can absolutely, absolutely be done from home. So we're starting to see a lot more flexibility. Now, again, I think how that plays out over time And again, particularly come the fall as schools come back, what are companies' expectations going to be? But I think the old notion that the only way anyone could ever be productive was sitting in the same desk in the same chair for 5 days a week, 40 hours. I just don't. I think that's starting to loosen, and I think people are starting to think a little more flexibly in general. How that will play out, I think, still remains to be seen.
Yeah, one of the things, I've had several discussions with several HR consultants, and one of the things they've been saying is, yeah, a lot of CEOs want to bring everyone back after this is over, but they've given up a lot of lease space. So there's not a lot of place to come back into. And the few articles I've read recently that there is almost a worker revolt saying, if you make me come back, I'm probably going to go find another job.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think it's going to vary a lot by employers, right? The fact of the matter is, in the US, worker power tends to be highly conditional, right? The most talented people have a lot of power. And are able to do that. Now, you can make the argument that those are the people that employers want to attract, and they have to create policies that will attract those people, which should, in theory, redound positively to everyone. Maybe. We'll see. I think it'll depend a lot by the company and the industry. I think there's companies that can get away with a certain amount of, we pay you so much and we're so prestigious that you're going to do it our way. And I think there's other employers that have to be more flexible. Look, from the perspective, my message to women would be, there has never been a better time to find the types of employers who are going to support you in your career and in your life. And I almost feel like, don't worry about what, the big name brand folks are doing. Like, don't even get concerned about that, because you can find great companies that are actually leveraging what's happening right now as an opportunity to think different about how they want to organize their workforce, managers who want to think different and manage differently. And it may take some sleuthing and some networking to find those opportunities, but you can, and there's never been a better time to do so.
So I had a conversation with Carol Fishman Cohen.
Yeah.
And I relaunched several months ago. I had her back on the podcast. Similarly, I had her back on. I wanted to have you back on. Is they've gone international. Is that something that you have looked at?
So we work with a couple employers that do global programs, and we have a couple partners in other countries that we work with when an employer wants to source candidates. Our audience is US based. But the programs that we create when we work with a global employer, are very similar across geography. So we can certainly help companies set up global programs. It's, the types of programs that work vary a bit, but this is a problem, which is interesting. It's interesting, by the way, that we think of places like Europe as having all these great family-friendly policies, and many of them do. Obviously, many of them have much better policies than the US has. And these are still struggles. It's struggles for women in the UK and for women in Germany. And there's a woman that I know who runs a program like this in Switzerland. And, of all places, you think of it as one of those countries that, has great policies, and they do, but it can still be very challenging. So, and one place we see a lot of companies running programs like this is India. India has a large population of extremely well-educated women and extremely well-educated specifically in technology. Who, take a little bit of time off, but then want to resume their careers. So there's a number of organizations that are similar to us that help big companies run programs in India. So yeah, that's definitely a trend we've seen for sure.
So if someone wanted to find a returnship, what should they be doing?
So there's a couple things they should be doing. They certainly should sign up for the Path Forward newsletter. So you can come to the Path Forward website, sign up for our newsletter. And anytime we're running a program with an employer, We send emails with all of the different options. We do have a page on our website that we call, returnships around the U.S., where we try to list every company that we know of that runs a program. That's going to take a little more sleuthing on your part to kind of go and see, because we don't, obviously, if we're not working directly with that employer, we may not know exactly when they have opportunities. But we try to keep good track of all the companies out there that are running them. But you can also go into Google and type in returnships. I mean, there's never been more information out there about some of those opportunities, and start to look for them. We think there's about maybe 100 or so companies a year that are running these programs, maybe a few hundred that have ever had a program that could theoretically be revived. So there's definitely some good opportunities out there.
So what do you see the future? If you had a crystal ball and you could look at the end of 2021 and into 2022, what would you see?
I think employers are going to start to see returnships as like another thing that is like, it's like college internships were, maybe a decade or so ago, like something novel that maybe a couple of people did, but then like all of a sudden everybody started doing them, and it became a normal part of recruiting. Companies now have entire departments called university recruiting, and part of what they do is bring in new grads, but also bring in their college internship classes. So I think returnships are going to become really normalized. Like, I think the idea of making it a part of your hiring practice, where you just have this as an ongoing program to tap into a talent pool on a regular basis, I think it's just going to become a lot more normalized. I think we're going to start to see some bigger companies that have been running programs for a while try to really expand those programs. And so last week, Amazon announced that they are expanding their program. They are targeting a goal of about 1,000 people over the next couple of years, which easily makes it the biggest program that we know of. There's a couple large companies that have goals around 100 returnees in a year. And I think we're going to see that in 22. I think we're going to see probably not a ton of companies doing goals like that, but at least a few big ones that are targeting, 100 returnees or more. And I think that's partly because I think the hiring is going to be so robust next year that companies are going to see an opportunity to bring in bigger cohorts. But I think there's also just going to be a slightly bigger pool of large companies that have got their sea legs under them around running these programs and feel like they have enough internal expertise and support structures set up that they can start to run those bigger cohorts and really take advantage of, in a good way, take advantage of the fact that so many people are looking to restart their careers.
Right now, you're primarily tech. You're not entirely tech. Do you see it expanding into other industries?
I do. I mean, look, I think one of the things that's been interesting about the technology sector is the technology sector recognized back in 2014 and 15, around that time, that they had a gender problem, and then they also had a talent problem. So they had two sources of pressure that led to a lot of different initiatives, including returnships at a lot of these companies. I think as we think about the big reshuffle that's about to happen, as we were saying, where people are looking for different kinds of things, they're looking for different kinds of flexibility, I think the talent crunch may start to affect more industries in ways that it hasn't before. And while some of those industries may have issues around gender and some of them may not, if they have enough of a talent shortage, they may feel like, I'm going to look for any source of talent. So, I think healthcare is probably an industry that we're going to see some shuffling going around. Obviously, there's a lot of people whose careers in healthcare were changed dramatically by the pandemic. So we may see some healthcare systems that are starting to look for diverse sources of talent. And I mean that diverse both in the traditional sense of diverse, but also in the pools we haven't looked in before sense. I think we could see it on the consumer packaged goods side, where that's obviously an industry that's had a lot of change over the last year. So I think we could see expansions in some other big industries as companies grapple with the changes that are happening throughout the labor force.
Yeah, it's interesting. I worked for IBM back in the 1980s, and IBM could not get enough programmers coming out of the universities. Because I graduated with a computer science degree in 1978, and so IBM back then and a number of the big tech companies started recruiting women into various different training programs. These are women with college degrees to train them as programmers, because they saw that as an easy way to solve the problem. So this isn't the first time.
Yeah, we had a returnee. One of our very first returnees was a woman who had graduated with an electrical engineering degree in, I don't know, the 70s, the 80s. And she went to IBM, and she had taken like one class in Fortran and one class in COBOL, and they were like good enough, and put her into the programming training program because like they just didn't have enough of anybody. And so, yeah, it's always interesting to me.
Tammy, this has been really good. If somebody wants to reach out and touch you and contact you, and we have to have social distancing, so it has to be virtual.
Right. Socially in a COVID appropriate way.
That's
yes.
Right. So how might they do that?
So the easiest way to get in touch with me is actually through our staff email address, which is hello. We like to try to be friendly. So it's hello@pathforward.org. And before you think, oh gosh, she's sending me to some inbox that no one ever looks at, it literally actually goes to everyone in our staff, including me. So I always see those. But I like to use that address with people because it's the fastest path to the right answer within the Path Forward staff. So if you're looking to find out if we can help you set up a program, Hello Ad is a great place. We've got folks on there who work with employers all day, every day. If you want information about our returnship programs, our program staff is on there. If you'd like to talk to me more about the things that we do, as I said, I see those emails as well. So hello@pathforward.org, drop us a line, and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Well, Tammy, thank you once again for returning to the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
This was great, Mark. Thanks so much for everything you do. It's a fun show.
I hope you gained some perspective on returnships and whether they be right for you. Make sure to check out the Path Forward website at pathforward.org. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While you're there, don't forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter @Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You'll find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-229. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. I hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?